I'm Ray Pinney. Welcome to Education Matters. This is a special edition. We'll be talking about suicide among our students. With me is George Scott from the Traumatic Loss Coalition at Rutgers. George, is not an easy topic to talk about.
Not
it
at
affects
all.
everyone. How prevalent is it in the nation and New Jersey?
Yeah, I'll use the national figures and the state figures. It is the third leading cause of death for kids between the ages of 10 and 24. So that's pretty significant. You know, the first two being accidental injury, the second being homicide, and then right behind that is suicide. And we are seeing across the nation these slight upticks in both males and females. So it's not an epidemic. Not everybody thinks about dying, but we need to be aware of it because for those kids and adults who suffer, we want to be able to provide some help to help keep them alive.
Is there does this cross all socioeconomic lines? Is it a certain group? Is it more prevalent among boys? Is there any, or is it just across the whole sector?
There are interesting demographics that have been and continue to hold. For instance, more males die by suicide than females. That's usually because males use more aggressive means to take their lives. Girls give us more time to intervene. For instance, if you take pills and you tell somebody, there's an opportunity for adult to intervene and save your life. So more males than females, white males generally more than other subcategories of ethnicity. So they're the big demographics. We are beginning to see upticks in some of the other groups, our Latino groups, African American male groups. We see an uptick, but right now the original pattern still holds.
All right, when a suicide happens, there's a ripple effect. It affects the school, it affects the staff. How do you deal with that? Or what are the effects within a building or outside the building?
Sure. When the Traumatic Loss Coalition gets a phone call, usually from the principal or the superintendent, and says we've had a suicide death, could the lead response team come and help? What we know is that it's going to have a huge emotional impact on kids and staff. So we're highly sensitive to the fact that we need to be clear in our messages. We need to be clear whether or not officially it is a suicide. You know, we respond when both the medical examiner identifies it as a suicide death, but the parents are also able to acknowledge that it's a suicide death, then we're kind of free to talk about it as such. Not all families can do that. For instance, on an overdose death, is it a suicide? Was the intent to die? Or is there such a cultural stigma to a suicide death that it's really difficult to even acknowledge it? So when we go in, we're looking for kids most affected, adults most affected, and then we begin to set up counseling throughout the school throughout the next 2 or 3 days.
You know, I've been talking about after something happens a little bit. Do you do training with staffs beforehand, not just on this, but on other things, so that when something happens, they're a little bit prepared? No one's ever completely prepared.
Yeah. Part of the mission of the TLC is suicide prevention. Now, we also segue then, the legislature several years ago passed a law that says that schools have to offer 2 hours of suicide awareness training to the entire staff, not just teachers, the entire staff. So often we're called to do that. Often we're called to do live trainings and presentations, looking at risk factors, warning signs. What are your resources? What do you do when you're concerned about a kid's behavior?
And one final thing, do people feel guilt, say a staff member, that something happened and they felt like they missed all the signs?
Yeah, we see that, you know, among friends. We see that among staff members. We see that among family members. Many times the symptoms are not so obvious. Usually, however, after the fact, when the puzzle pieces are put together, we begin to see this pattern of behavior to let us know that there was suffering going on that then resulted in that suicide death.
But it's always easier to see it after the event and work
Always, which is why we always try to elevate people's understanding or what are the signs and symptoms of suicide.
So that's one part of your mission too, is
Very
to
much so.
do a preventive training.
Absolutely. Lots of prevention.
Okay. I'd like to thank George Scott for joining me on this episode of Education Matters, where we talked about suicide.